Welcome to the Officially Denied podcast. I'm Toby.
And I'm Peter.
So, I'd like to kick the podcast off firstly, thanking everybody who's listened to the pilot episode. Got positive response, even on Anchor. Anchor is an app where you can share podcasts directly from your phone or from a computer. You can upload them. It's a bit of a strange system, but it's up and coming. And on Anchor, we had somebody call in and actually give us their opinion verbally, which was very nice. And we had a lot of comments and claps, as they do on Anchor, which is basically a like. So thank you very much for that.
Right, okay, so you are aware of this poll that was carried out by Comries over the past few days, and it's gotten quite a lot of traction in, especially in, I guess, right-wing media. I think it was first mentioned in the Times, and then after that it was picked up by everyone from the Daily Mail, and so on. And I kind of want to talk about this because it's gotten a lot of traction, and I feel like everyone with an agenda has basically misinterpreted it for their own ends. So the poll was asking those aged 18 to 24, so kind of the younger subsection of what we would consider to be young people, mainly falling into the student demographic. And the question was asked, which of the following are the most dangerous in the world today? And the options being communists, right-wing pundits, politicians and donors, big business, high-taxing governments, capitalists, left-wing unions, politicians and campaigners. And much of the narrative surrounding this has been the fact that more young people in the UK think that capitalism is a bigger danger than communism. And so as a result, you have had quite a plethora of people come out and say that this shows that universities are brainwashing the youth into Marxism, and we need to do something about this. So what do you think, Toby? Are universities turning the youth into secret communist sympathizers?
Well, many surveys have been conducted, such as this one, show that there is a left-wing bias in higher education, particularly universities. And it's interesting because, keep in mind, the demographic we are dealing with is mainly middle-class people, would be fair enough to say. Mainly, of course, there's other economic / social classes present in these in universities, but it's mainly middle class. And I have noticed a lot of left-wing / socialist tendencies in universities, but not in an intrusive way, at least in my experience. I don't know about you, but what kind of things have you seen on your campus that maybe contribute to this feeling?
Well, I mean, here's the thing, and this might sound like a strange thing to say, but, I mean, we have to put aside that, you know, you and me, we live in what is essentially of this politically aware bubble. We both study politics, we hang out with people who are very politically minded, we go to university, clubs and societies which are focused on discussing politics and conducting politics. And I think this might lead someone like you and me to assume that universities are this haven of left-wing activity, which, I mean, the truth is that young people aren't actually that left-wing. And this might sound crazy because, you know, most of them voted Labour at the last election, and I'll come on to this in a moment. I mean, I think this is a classic example of people taking a survey or a study that has been done and kind of looking at the results essentially in the wrong way. I mean, let me put it to you this way. Less than a quarter of young people in the UK, according to this poll, think that big business is a danger to the world. Less than a quarter. Only 12% think that capitalists are a danger to the world. Now, yeah, more people think that capitalists, according to this poll, are a danger than communists, but Stephen Bush in The New Statesman had a pretty good analogy for this. It's a bit like asking young people whether they're more scared of a mugger or a saber-toothed tiger.
Of course, the reality of a student coming across a saber-toothed tiger is non-existent.
Yeah, well, exactly. Or it would be like asking a bunch of sailors on a ship sailing through the Gulf of Eden whether they are more scared of Somali pirates or the Spanish Armada.
Exactly.
I mean, the point being is that communists don't really exist in Britain as a big organized political force. They don't control a single influential media outlet. They have no representatives in parliament, unless, of course, you're one of those who believes that Jeremy Corbyn is a communist, in which case, fair enough. I mean, it is clear, unless you are someone who thinks that capitalism is perfect and there is no issue at all with big business or right-wing politicians or right-wing media. It's quite extraordinary to take that and say that therefore people are kind of communist sympathizers just because you don't have.
Of course,
we have a right-wing government, a overwhelmingly right-wing press, at least. I mean, just some stats for you, just off the top of my head. The Communist Party of Britain has about 700 members.
700, yeah.
You can, of course, again, there will be those who say that, well, of course, they don't have any members because they're all in the Labour Party now. But they haven't had any members for a while, even before Jeremy Corbyn became Labour leader.
Exactly. But going back to the study at hand, keep in mind that it was published by the Marxist Student Federation, and the sample size was, it says over 3,000 students.
I think it was just over 2,000.
Really? This article says 3,000. Well, let's say 2,500. 2,500 students across 32 universities in the UK is not. I personally would think it's not a large enough sample size to make such a sweeping generalization as they've made.
Well, I mean, obviously no poll is perfect. There's a margin of error of some degree that exists, I think. But again, like, even with the results that we have here, I just don't see this as evidence that there is a giant resurgence of some kind of millennial Marxism in university campuses. I mean, I'm just looking at this article in the Times here, where I think this was where it was originally mentioned, and they cite something called the Marxist Student Federation, which claims to have 3,000 students signed up to its societies across all of the UK's universities. That's 3,000 out of a total student population in the UK of over 2 million.
Yeah.
But I mean, coming back to the point raised earlier, outside of the political bubble in which people like me and you exist, I genuinely don't think that young people are that left-wing. I don't think students are that left-wing. And at least partly because they're just not very political at all. Like,
no, the level of political engagement outside of my politically minded social circles is very, very low. I'm sure you've noticed the same.
Well, yeah, I mean, I've actually canvassed students in the local area as part of the local elections that we have coming up here in May. And the vast majority of those that I have spoken to, I mean, the response is usually, honestly, the most common was, I didn't know there was going to be local elections. I don't really support a single political party. Those that did vote in the general election last year, the vast majority voted Labour, but that's not because they're that economically left-wing, that's just because they don't want to be £40,000 in student debt.
Yeah, a lot of young voters who vote Labour are riding on the "we will abolish tuition fees" promise, which is fair enough considering that if you're not politically minded and you're a student, that is a very attractive proposition made by a political party. Yeah. But moving on about social repercussions of this millennial Marxist society that we live in, according to the study, I have noticed.
Well, again, but it doesn't say that. Like,
no,
only less than. Again, I want to reiterate this. Less than a quarter of young people in the UK, according to that poll, think that big business is a danger, and less than a quarter think that right-wing media, right-wing politicians are a threat.
True.
Again, if I was looking at this through an entirely objective lens, my initial reaction would be, oh, that little? And 9% think that communists are a great threat. Again, I think that's quite a lot who think that communists are a great threat. For at least, that's quite a lot of people who think that an essentially non-existent political force is genuinely a danger to the UK.
Yeah, definitely. And those people answering, not to make a wild assumption, but would most likely not be very politically aware and assume that, say, Labour is a very hard left-wing party.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's how you measure that, right?
Of course.
I mean, with regards to young people, the reason Labour had such a high student vote at the last election was because they rode on the tuition fees promise, which that doesn't necessarily mean someone is economically a Marxist or even that left-wing. You don't want to be in student debt, so you're going to vote for a party that wants to abolish student loans. I mean, it's not exactly rocket science to come to that conclusion. I mean, it's kind of funny because, I mean, putting aside the whole issue of whether, abolishing tuition fees is right or wrong, it is, I mean, as you kind of alluded to earlier, it is a very middle-class policy. And it kind of relates to something which I guess supporters of the current Labour leadership don't really like talking about, which is that if you look at that, super left-wing Marxist Labour manifesto last June, it was a program which had as its two main big pledges, which were the abolition of fees and rail nationalisation. Those are two very, very middle-class policies. And especially the latter. Now, personally, I'm in favor of nationalizing the railways, but, I'm an upper middle-class kind of guy who uses a lot of trains.
Yeah, same. I do use a lot of trains now, and coming from growing up in a country which had national rail, Spain, which it's not entirely nationalized. There is a small private part of it, but that's not relevant. It is essentially a nationalized rail, and it is cheaper to get a train from Madrid to Barcelona than it is to catch a train from Manchester to London, for example, which is just incredibly expensive.
Precisely. And so therefore it's not a stretch to then think why a lot of students who rely on trains, who don't want to be in student debt, decided to vote for a party which championed those two promises. Again, a more working class version of that transport policy would maybe be to renationalize, country buses, or try to lower petrol prices.
Of course, which, to be honest, I wouldn't be against the nationalizing of buses, because seeing as it's also quite expensive depending what area you live in, depending what city you're in, buses can be much more expensive than they really should be.
Yeah, and I mean, as I said, this is something that both sides, I think, or at least both extremes in the current political party landscape don't really like talking about, because a lot of people on the right, I feel, like to use the scapegoat that, well, universities are just so damn left-wing that we just essentially getting your excuses in early for when you will lose the next election if you do that. And people on the left, of the Labour Party at least, don't really like admitting it, because they really don't like the idea that Jeremy Corbyn essentially assembled the most Blairite electoral coalition in the history of the British Labour Party. Alright, so should we talk about UKIP?
Yeah, let's fucking do it.
So for anyone who isn't aware, the current UKIP leader, Henry Bolton, if you don't know who that is, I don't blame you, has recently got himself into a lot of trouble with, well, seemingly everyone, including his own party, after his 25-year-old girlfriend, of about a month old, was revealed to have sent extremely racist text messages about Meghan Markle. That is how you pronounce it, right?
Yeah, I think that's the correct pronunciation.
About Meghan Markle, who is, of course, the fiancée of Prince Harry, saying that she was afraid that the marriage would end up tainting the monarchy and leading to a black king. Apparently, the friend who she had that text conversation with responded by saying, "Isn't that a bit racist?" And she said, "Yes, so what?" Anyway, the point...
Well, I for one, am extremely shocked that the leader of UKIP is dating someone who's racist. I mean, how would someone who is in a party that is, frankly, not very racist in a relationship with someone who's that racist?
Well, I don't think the issue. I don't think I don't think the draw for him was the fact that she was.
I don't think racism is a kink. I mean, maybe it is, but
I don't think he was drawn into this relationship because of her social views. I think it was more the fact that he's a 54-year-old guy and she's a 25-year-old model who is younger than some of his daughters. Again, this is all kind of weird because, of course, if you were following the UKIP leadership race, the fifth one or the fourth one of the past few years, again, if you weren't, I don't blame you. Henry Bolton essentially ran as kind of a family values kind of guy. And then months after assuming his role, he has separated from his third wife to take on this relationship. The actual implications for this, of course, is that UKIP may very well find itself searching for a new leader. I think there is some kind of party machinations going on this weekend, which might result in him being removed by their executive committee or whatever they call it.
Yeah, which would not be surprising at all. They obviously are going to have a shake-up of the internal structure of the parties after this news.
I mean, UKIP is stuck in a bit of a pickle here, because clearly they don't want to keep on a leader who has essentially become a national embarrassment. And this whole racism scandal is what the vast majority of people associate him with now. Because probably before this, many of them wouldn't have heard of him.
Didn't know who he was, yeah.
Exactly. I mean, I didn't know who he was until he became UKIP leader.
I didn't know who he was until you sent me a message 3 days ago over Facebook saying, "Have you read about Henry Bolton?" And I said, "Who's Henry Bolton?"
But the problem for the party now is that clearly they don't want to keep him as leader. But from what I've read today, their financial situation right now is so bad that they cannot physically afford another leadership election. If they do, they either will have to do a lot of fundraising, or the party will go bankrupt. We can laugh about this whole scandal as much as we want. I guess the bigger question here, does UKIP even have a role in the current British political landscape? And I'll put it to you this way. Is this the time where they should just say, fuck it, and disband?
If I were one of the higher-ups in UKIP, I would jump ship right now. They just don't have the traction. Imagine if there's another general election in the next 2 years. How would they, if they can barely afford to keep their own internal affairs afloat, how would they even be able to support a campaign? It just makes absolutely no sense to continue as a political party.
I haven't actually thought of it in that way, but you're completely right. I mean, of course, the next election is likely 4 years away. But yeah, if they don't have the funds to even have another leadership election, how can they have any sort of resources to launch even a regional campaign, never mind a national one, which is what they tried to do in 2015? So I ended up watching that whole interview between Cathy Newman and Jordan Peterson.
Yeah, I did too. I was not a big fan of the interview as a whole, but I'll let you go first with your views on how the debate went. Would you consider there was a winner in the debate, if there even is a winner in debates?
I think everyone was kind of a loser there. As in, not the people who were actually involved in that, but that interview really kind of annoyed me, in a way, because clearly Kathy Newman did not do a very good job in scrutinizing Peterson's ideas, partly because she came at this from a very kind of conventional mainstream media perspective, which has a very rigid stance on a lot of these issues.
Yes.
And therefore the conversation went kind of really stiff, and she would freak out over things which I think she could have approached through a slightly different way.
She could have been a lot more tactful about the way she approached the interview. That's true. But
I mean,
if we strip it back, let's strip it back to the basics of how to conduct an interview. She clearly was not listening to Peterson's views. Her follow-up questions to his answers were sometimes completely different, or just using a completely different analogy even to what he was talking about, what he was referencing in his answer. So it was a clear response. Kathy wanted to get out of her interview subject, and she was pushing for that response, yet he was not budging because he was relatively well-informed and relatively okay.
I mean, clearly she just wanted him to say something outrageous so they could stick it up on a 30-second clip on Twitter and have it be retweeted a bunch. I mean, again, I think the problem is that, I mean, the conversation kind of shifted, like, she would ask Jordan Peterson, you know, do you think there is a gender wage gap? And he would say something like, well, I think there is a skills gap or an earnings gap. And she would come back with and she would just be really outraged and say something about, oh, so you hate women?
Yeah, which is just completely fallacious when it comes to arguments being presented from both sides. They were both... He was dodging questions and answering in very wishy-washy ways, but Kathy Newman's responses were just straight-up fallacies.
And, you know, as I said, and the reason I find this so irritating is it doesn't take a genius to dismantle Jordan Peterson. You know, no. This is a guy who was essentially managed to make himself into a right-wing conservative internet celebrity, originally through being a bit of a dick to transgender students in Canada and spreading literal fake news about Canadian discrimination laws. So he becomes a bit of an internet celebrity through that. He's now earning like $1 million on Patreon because of course he damn is. But I mean, he spends his entire time talking about a few very select issues which are now very popular in online discussion, especially for conservatives, which is free speech on university campuses, kind of the whole ultra PC left, safe spaces, trigger warning kind of culture, and radical feminism. Now, the problem I have with that is it's kind of like shooting fish in a barrel. Anyone who's sort of reasonable can agree that, yeah, like, trigger warnings are silly, safe spaces are dumb, yeah, we shouldn't, like, try to censor people's opinions, and, in fact, this is largely an imaginary problem as far as the UK is concerned anyway. The thing about Jordan Peterson, which I find, is that the moment he starts talking about something slightly more intellectually stimulating, he kind of falls apart. If you need a good example of that, just look up the guy's views on religion. I mean, he's basically a biblical realist.
He's easy to pick apart because he is very flashy in the sense that all the things that he does are meant to attract the attention of liberal media because his ideas do resound with what many people would call the alt-right, and he's just mainly, as he even admits to saying in the interview, which I just thought really sums up well who Jordan Peterson is. He says, I am a provocateur. And that is exactly what he was doing right there in that interview.
Yeah, and I think as I mentioned to you earlier, like, great, so if you want to be a slightly more intellectual version of Milo Yiannopoulos, I mean, credit where credit is due. Jordan Peterson talks in a very kind of soothing way. He can occasionally say ridiculous stuff whilst making it sound really clever. But again, it's kind of hard not to get away from the fact that the issues that he chooses to tackle are hardly the most difficult questions facing us. Tearing apart sections of the comically ultra PC left is like shooting fish in a barrel, as I said.
I think it's just fair to say, to conclude this section on the interview, that Channel 4 just did this to stir shit up and draw some attention to both the interviewer and the interviewee, because, as we both agreed, Channel 4 is just trying to be the edgier BBC.
Yeah, they're a slightly edgier, openly progressive version of the Beam.
Moving on to entertainment, seeing as last week our discussion on Black Mirror and our favourite films seemed to be quite well received, and there seems to be some interest for our points of views on films.
Yep.
We could talk about the fact that movie theatre attendance hits a 24-year low and ticket prices rise nearly 4%, according to The Wrap. So I'm going to ask you, Peter, about your viewing habits when it comes to films. I know you're a film fan. You are part of the Bad Film Society at your university. But what are your viewing habits?
I watch good films as well, occasionally.
Well, I would hope so. The question is, what are your viewing habits when it comes to seeing new films? Do you watch trailers, decide you're going to go see them to the cinema? Do you have a preferred cinema? What are your habits?
Right, well, I mean, I don't have a preferred cinema, but, I mean, I haven't actually heard of that stat. I find it kind of fascinating, at least because personally, I've definitely been going to the cinema a lot more over the past few months than I have before. But, like, why do you think that is? Why are less people going to the cinema?
Well, the article talks about the United States, and the main reason is the fact that tickets are so damn expensive. I found the contrast in my own life, at least, is that the cinema in the UK has always been the cheapest compared to Spain, compared to the US when I went to the cinema this summer when I was over there. It's just the exorbitant prices. I've seen a movement a couple months ago. There was a petition made for cinemas in the US, if I'm not mistaken, to lower the price of the popcorn and drink meal deal that they have. Because going to the cinema is not just, I'll pay £3, go to the cinema, enjoy a film and go home, as I've been able to do here. In the US, it does seem to be that you're going to be spending at least $20 per person for the whole cinema experience.
Yeah, and I mean, $20, that's 2 months of Netflix. To draw a comparison. I mean, do you think streaming services and the kind of the resurgence of TV through the medium of streaming platforms, do you think that has much to do with it?
I think, but only to a certain extent. I think it comes back to the ever relevant topic of quantity over quality. Netflix has a lot of high quality shows, but it also has a lot of content that is not very high quality. But the fact that they can keep pumping out content and keep adding content to their library makes it very attractive for a lot of viewers. But when it comes to quality, it's important to consider the cinema experience. For example, take the film that we spoke about last week, and we both agree is a fantastic film, is Dunkirk.
Right.
When I got to see it, not only did I see it in a cinema, but I saw it in a cinema which was the ultimate viewing experience for the film, basically. And Dunkirk just can't be watched on a 12-inch laptop screen.
Well, certainly the experience will be nowhere near as thrilling.
Yeah. It's such a visceral and raw experience that you can have when watching films, especially when they're crafted masterfully. So something like a Marvel film, I remember I was watching, if I'm not mistaken, it was Iron Man was on the telly over Christmas, and it felt very cartoonish seeing it on a TV screen. And I remember seeing it in the cinema, and it felt very epic and high impact.
I mean, it is kind of an interesting paradox that you mentioned, with falling cinema viewership. If you were a consultant to Odeon or AMC or whatever, would you just advise them to lower prices? Do you think that is the biggest issue driving down cinema viewership? Because, I mean, the statistic you cited, when exactly did this dip start happening? Because it's not like cinema was extremely cheap a few years ago.
No, it has always been decently expensive. But, for example, it says that, here to quote the article, it says, the National Alliance of Theatre Owners announced Wednesday that the national ticket average for 2017 rose 3.7% year over year to $8.93, up from $8.65, which is a hell of a lot of money.
Yeah, that's pretty interesting. Again, I haven't exactly done any market research into this. Not that I think I would be able to analyze something like this in kind of a thorough way. As a gut instinct, I would say it has something to do with rising cinema costs, and I do think streaming services kind of do play a big role in this. And maybe it's just a change in culture. I don't know.
I think it's a bit of both. Lowering the price of cinema tickets definitely makes an outing to the cinema much more plausible when it comes to planning out your day. I've certainly started going to cinema more since it's cheaper here than it was back in Spain. But the fact that, say, Black Mirror is such a high-quality show that you can watch for free if you're borrowing someone's Netflix or using the trial, or for the monthly price
or for the price of one cinema ticket.
Exactly.
For a month, yeah.
It's an interesting paradox. And as I said before, it's a bit of both. So once again, thank you very much for listening to the Officially Denied podcast. You can now find us on YouTube, SoundCloud, Anchor, and thank you to Anchor and their clever service. I have no idea how they do it. We are also up on iTunes, which consequently means we might be up on any other podcast service you use. So give us some feedback in the comments of whatever service you are using to listen to the podcast. If it's SoundCloud, drop a comment, drop a like, drop a repost. If you're on YouTube, subscribe to the channel to listen to our new episodes the day they come out. And recommend it to friends and family if you think they're going to enjoy it. We like hearing your opinions. We love to see what people have to say on the topics we've spoken about. And maybe we'll even engage in a mailbox further down the line if there is a high enough supply of comments and questions.
All right, so thanks again for listening, everyone, and we will see you next time.